We've been asked by our manager to set up a simple file server with a single data disk. We've also been told that we don't require the graphical interface to be installed, as most of the management will be done via PowerShell. Now this is a fairly easy task, but it does have a lot of steps. So let's begin on the Azure Portal default homepage, where we'll start our deployment of Windows Server 2019 Virtual Machine. Well, first, we'll click on All Services, then under Compute, click on Virtual Machines, and then on our list of virtual machines, click Add. Now let's go ahead and hide the virtual machines pane off to the side to give ourselves a bit more screen real estate. So our first step will be to provide the basic settings of our virtual machine on the aptly named Basics tab, where the bulk of the settings are configured. Now we'll start by selecting an appropriate resource group. I'm going to choose David Lamb-RG from the drop-down list that'll allow me to manage all of my resources created in this group as a single resource. Now before we go too much further, note that if you hover your mouse over the eye, the Azure Portal will pop up additional information about each setting. Now we need to give our new virtual machine a name, so we'll call it WS 2019-File02. Now please note the naming conventions are listed off to the side of the text box, and you'll see that in quite a few places where Azure provides context-sensitive hints like this. Next, we need to choose a region. Now, as I'm located in Canada, I'm going to choose Canada Central. Now, you might be expecting a joke about the cooling in Canada being better, but I think a joke like that might be a little cold-hearted. You're going to want to choose a region that works best for you, perhaps based on your geographic location and whether or not you have any requirements about what country your data is located in. Now that we have a region selected, we need to choose our operating system image. Now these images are more or less ready-to-go installations of various operating systems that only take a few minutes to deploy. And this goes a lot faster than the classic installation of an OS. So we'll click on the Browse All Images and Disks. Now as we're setting up Windows Server 2019, we're going to type in Windows Server 2019 in the search bar to narrow down the list a bit. And we'll select the Windows Server 2019 Data Center Server Core, which will give us the power of Windows Server without all the unnecessary graphical fluff that can slow it down. Now we also need to choose our virtual machine size. This gives us an opportunity to specify just how powerful the virtual machine will be. So click on Change Size. And keep in mind that we do need to balance that power against the operating cost of our virtual machines. So in this case, we're going to choose B2MS, which will give us 2 CPU cores and 8 GB of RAM without going overboard on our budget. Once we've got that selected, just click on the Select button at the bottom. Now we're also prompted to create an administrator account. Now this is the local administrator account for the VM that we'll use later on to connect to the server. So I'll go ahead and give it the name of WS 2019 Admin. And then I just need to enter and confirm my password. Now we do need to adhere to the requirements of at least 12 characters and a mixture of 3 of the following 4. Uppercase, lowercase, special characters, and numbers. Next up is our inbound port rules. The public inbound ports need to be defined if we want to be able to access this server from the internet. So we'll click on Allow Selected Ports, and since we want to be able to get to the desktop of our new server from our Windows client, we're going to choose RDP as our inbound port type. Now, since we've configured the basic settings for our server, the next step is to move on to the disks page to configure our storage. Now for our OS disk type, we're going to leave it on Premium SSD, which will give us the highest level of performance for this disk. Now if we didn't need a disk with such high performance, we could go with a more budget-friendly standard SSD, or the slowest and least expensive standard hard disk drive. Now since we need a data disk for our file server, we'll click on the Create and Attach a New Disk. Here we can select our disk type. Standard SSD I think we're going to choose in this case, as we want to balance the performance versus the price. Now we'll accept the default for the name, but we will change the data disk size to 500 GB since we don't need a large disk for this server. And we'll leave the source type as none so that we end up with a blank disk to start. Now with all that set, we'll click on OK. And our storage is configured, so let's move on to networking. Now we need to specify a virtual network and a subnet for our VM to communicate internally, and a public IP to communicate with the internet. Now since we have a virtual network and subnet already configured in this resource group, those have been selected for us by default. We could change those if needed and create new ones, but for this demo, these settings are going to be fine. Now for the public IP, Azure has proposed a configuration for us. Now it's worth noting that any new network resources created here are going to be placed in the same location and resource group as the storage we configured previously. As we've already configured our inbound ports on the basics page, we don't need to change those settings here and can move on to management. Now, as this is just a demo, we're going to turn off the boot diagnostics. For a production system, you might want to leave the boot diagnostics on, so that way if your virtual machine doesn't boot, you'll be able to figure out why. Now, with all of our management settings set the way we want them, let's move on to the guest config page. Now, the guest config page allows us to specify additional scripts or post-configuration steps that we want to take. But as we don't need any of those at this point, we're just going to move on to the Tags tab. Now, tags are a nice way to categorize groups of resources and lets you search for the tags across multiple resource groups. In this case, we're going to configure the key as environment, and the value is going to be demo. And we're going to apply that to all of the resources that will be created for this virtual machine. Now that we're finished with the configuration of our virtual machine settings, we can go ahead and click on the Review and Create. Now we'll give this a moment to run the validation tests, and they passed. Now this gives us a chance to review our settings before proceeding and make any last-minute changes. If we look under Product Details, we now have a value for the per-hour cost of running our new virtual machine. So we'll do a quick review of the rest of the settings, and when we're good to go, we can click on Create. Now this deployment process, while fairly short, does still take a few minutes. So this might be a good time to skim this week's blog post on what's new in Azure. And look at that, our deployment was successful. So we'll click on the Pin to Dashboard here. That'll give us easier access to this virtual machine in the future, as it places a link on our default Azure dashboard. And then we'll click on the Go to Resource button, and that'll bring us to the main page for our new VM. As you can see here, our Windows Server 2019 VM status is listed as running. Now, finally, we'll want to connect to the virtual machine using our remote desktop client so that we can verify that the VM is ready to go. To connect, we simply click Connect. And this provides us with an opportunity to download the RDP connection file to our local client so that we'll be able to connect later on without logging into the portal each time. So we'll click on Download RDP file, and click on Save As, and as this is just a demo, we're going to save this to our desktop. And we'll click on Open to launch our RDP connection. Now this is the first time we're connecting to this VM. We get a warning about connecting to it. Now as we know this is our new VM, we can click on the Connect button to proceed. And we now need to enter the credentials for the local administrator account we created earlier in this demo. Enter the username and the password, and then click on OK. And again, as this is the first time connecting to this VM, we get a certificate error. Again, we know this is our new VM, we can click Yes to proceed. And now that we're logged in, we can start PowerShell, and from here, hand it over to someone to complete the configuration. And that's all there is to it. Thanks for watching.